In part 2, I left off with a mention of the last premise that Richard Dawkins refers to as barking mad, this Christian belief that God sacrificed himself to appease himself. Now, my comment on this is that this belief will actually never even surface unless you try to reconcile Christianity's conflicting storylines. So what I mean by this is that the Bible really has two separate stories going on. From when I read the New Testament, most of the passages seem to refer to Jesus as God's Son, just separate from God. Jesus even asked God at one point, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27, verse 46. But there are also passages when it could be argued that Jesus and God are one. Arguably, though, the real weight behind this interpretation is that the religion considers itself monotheistic. So there really shouldn't be two separate divine beings in there. Anyway, but aside from Christian apologists, I find that many, maybe even most, Christians don't study their religion all that closely, and they're just really unaware that the New Testament contains a bit of tension in this area. That is, that these two separate storylines don't really mesh with each other very well. Now, usually when I interview Christians, I try to stick just to apologists and proselytizers. But in preparation for this video, I interviewed people who I describe as casual Christians. People who are raised Christian, call themselves Christian, may go to church for social reasons or maybe special holidays. But other than that, they don't give their religion a whole lot of thought. And the interview that I had with one of my casual Christian neighbors was typical in the sense that she never thought about some of the difficulties that arise from the idea that Jesus is God and God's Son. I mean, she was, of course, familiar with the idea that Jesus is God's Son and familiar with the idea that Jesus is God, but she always kept those ideas completely separate from each other. So when I mentioned how reconciling these two separate stories made the whole issue of Jesus dying on the cross to appease God's anger just was a bit odd, because if Jesus is God, well, again, that means God sacrificing himself to appease himself, which is kind of like if you're mad at your kids for some wrongdoing on their part. Your anger at them can be appeased by stabbing yourself. And my neighbor was just shocked by the realization that this was an unavoidable aspect of Christianity. She just opened her eyes real wide and said, "Holy shit, never thought about that before." All right, now given that based solely on reading the New Testament, I mean, the relationship between Jesus and God, it could really be interpreted in several different ways. One might ask why most of Christianity goes along with this belief that Christ can be his own Father and God can be his own Son, and that the Son was begotten by the Father but existed before being begot. But to really answer that question involves going on something of a long tangent on the Trinity and Constantine and on the Council of Nicaea that was held in 325 and all the political and religious compromises, and that would just be too big a tangent for the purpose of this video. And also, many of you watching this probably already know about the issues behind the Council of Nicaea, and for those who don't, the information is widely available. I mean, my book is one of those sources, but it's in lots of places. All right, so I'm not going to go on a long Trinity tangent, but I'll just say that my feeling on this is that the New Testament is just not very well edited in this respect. But in dealing with books that are sacred, it's not easy to just revise and clean up the writing. So the church had to leave the conflicting storylines intact and instead just struggle to come up with an interpretation that can reconcile or smooth out the conflicts. Now, my feeling is that this reconciliation attempt, the whole Trinity thing, is just not all that successful. But it turns out really not to matter all that much, because most believers have no trouble with what George Orwell would call doublethink. That is, holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. And it's not much of a problem to switch back and forth between these conflicting stories, fully believing or fully forgetting either one as circumstances dictate. I should also mention that the capacity for doublethink is certainly not limited to Christians. Most of us probably do this in some aspects of our life, regardless of our religious beliefs. Anyway, when it comes to the story of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, at that point, Jesus is God's Son. Jesus and God are two separate entities. When it comes to worshiping the one true God, well, that's when we think of God coming to earth as Jesus to teach us. So in that storyline, God and Jesus are one. Now, the skilled Christian apologist has a more complex interpretation, but like I said in part one, for better or worse, that won't be a part of this presentation. All right, so to summarize why I think the premises that Dawkins refers to as barking mad are really not all that barking mad, at least not from the perspective of comparative mythology. All right, as for divine anger, well, that makes sense from the perspective that ancient people used to attribute nature's utter indifference for us as the mood swings of the supernatural. As for the demand for sacrifice, well, this makes sense from the perspective that ancient people were desperate to somehow get on the good side of the gods. As for the hope that a scapegoat will serve as that sacrifice, well, that makes sense. It's certainly more convenient to sacrifice a scapegoat than to have to give up something of your own. As for the idea of God sacrificing himself to appease himself, I believe that's not all that crazy either, because it's really not in the Bible. It's just something of an unintended consequence that happened when the church was trying to reconcile the New Testament's contradictory passages. Now, Is it rational to hold all these beliefs today? Is it rational to take these ancient tribal beliefs about angry gods demanding blood sacrifices and try to combine this with the at least relatively recent belief in a monotheistic God that's all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent? Most non-Christians will say no, that these beliefs really are incoherent. To believe them in today's world, that is barking mad. Christian apologists will be able to explain why it is absolutely rational, and through a discussion on original sin, free will, God's justice and punishment, God's sorrow, mercy, God's love, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice, and some complex details on the Trinity, Christian apologists really can't explain it all. To those of you who classify yourself on the fence or seekers of the truth, and I have received several emails from people in that category, I can only ask that you examine the logic and evidence from each side and take it from there. Thanks for watching.